The stone room is not so much dark as full of pressure. A girl sits on the cold floor, skirt of Anya wool bunched beneath her, hands folded because that is what they taught her. Her breath fogs and then steadies. The eunuch slides a bowl of chichar past the door. The bowl makes no sound. Outside, Cusco moves like a living city. But here the world narrows to a throat, and the tightening knowledge that the city keeps a ledger of lives. The girl is 8 years old, and she knows that when the curaka signs the quipu, and the apap panaka lifts his hand, her name will no longer be her own. They measured her mers and her posture, turned her face as if inspecting a pot, and checked for blemish with clinical fingers. The mamakuna, who watches at the threshold, is older than the building and colder than the wool. She recites no prayers aloud. Her duty is to record obedience into muscle and silence into habit. The girl thinks of home, of a mother who will be rewarded for her compliance with a sack of maize. And the thought curves into guilt, and then into the hollow place where a childhood used to be. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you and #39 re-listening from. I and #39 am genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. The selection is described by Pedro Tardulian and later by Garcilaso de la with procedural restraint. But here it is immediate hands, touch, judgment. Pacuti, the conqueror who rebuilt Cusco and reshaped the state in the mid-15th century, created institutions that turned beauty into tribute. The aclosi appears as policy in the same breath as the meter and the mitma, a mechanism as administrative as it is theological. Curakas from the provinces send daughters, and the empire takes what it wants. The Apple Panaka are not mythical. They are functionaries, mobile judges who travel on the royal roads to assess who will be incorporated into the imperial body. The girl learns a new language of posture and chant. She learns the names of the fabric she will never choose, and the geometry of the tapestry patterns that will mark noble cloth. To the mamakuna, she is raw material. To the chronicles, she is a symbol. To herself, she remains a girl who counts the days by the number of prayers she endures, and the distance her thoughts travel back to a valley she may never see again. In the courtyard of the Akalahasi faces, catalogued by Clark's, one day becomes indistinguishable from another. The girls are taught to speak with the vocabulary of the state, pronouncing the queso of Cusco, rather than the dialect of their Alu. They and #39 re-given new names or titles that mean nothing to their mothers. They are divided into ranks. The pious and the gurus are given labor. They will wash, cook, weave for local officials, and sometimes be assigned as concubines to lower nobility. The white aklas, the uraka color, are retained for higher functions to be woven into state diplomacy, ritual, and the technocratic machinery of power. The excel become paradoxically the most visible and the most invisible. They appear at feasts. They produce the finest kipparas patented come, by cloth reserved for the Sapa, Inca, and their bodies are kept as vessels of state sanctity. Papal analogies in later writing are wrong, but the effect is similar, a bureaucracy that sanctifies service and consecrates loss. Mothers in remote highland villages learn to keep a silence that looks like acceptance, because resistance risks collective punishment. The Curo explains with the language of obligation. The empire demands daughters. To refuse is to risk famine and massacre. The story of Curio, recorded by Garcilaso and other chroniclers, circulates like a warning under the cloistered roofs. Akla, who attempted escape, were not quietly punished. They were made public monuments to obedience. The account of a woman placed in a pit and slowly covered with earth until she suffocated is one of many punitive tales intended to translate the abstract law into an immediate terror. These punishments fulfill a double function. They deter insubordination, and they demonstrate the reach of the Sapper Inca, who demanded not only harvest and labor, but bodies in ceremonial servitude. The chronicles use language that bridges legalism and theology. The chosen are said to serve the sun, and the sun is also the symbol of imperial claim. The Ayla becomes a unit of tribute, and the language of tribute aims to obscure the human cost. To understand this as merely religious devotion is to miss the bureaucratic heart of the mechanism. It is a state policy that requires compliance enforced through ritualized violence. Pachacauti and #39. S reforms after 1438 are well documented. He expanded the road network, reorganized the provinces, and made Cusco into a court where diplomacy and surveillance were daily routines. But power needs instruments that touch the body, not only the land. The Acela system answers that need. It standardizes the collection of the best children, transforms them into apprenticeship centers for ceremonial labor and skilled textile production, and keeps the political elite supplied with symbolic brides and ritual gifts. A girl taken from a village near the Ville, and not may have become an Acola, not for her lineage, but for the symmetry of her face, for a lack of pockmarks on her skin, for a carriage of the head that suggested descent and health. The system feeds itself with selection, and reward with the curaka balancing local compliance against imperial violence. This is statecraft designed to be intimate. The empire does not only tax fields, it robs futures. In the Akalahiwasi, the education is exhaustive. The Mamakas teach textile patterns known as tukapu, songs to the sun, protocols for the palace, and strict sexual discipline. The presence of eunuchs is not a myth. Gatalasso writes of male attendants who acted as guardians. The Atlas are secluded with little or no contact with men. The ritualized purity the state demands is monitored and policed. This life is regimented and often luxurious immaterial, but it is slavery in its fundamental terms. Personal agency is suppressed in favor of a narrative where the girl becomes an object of piety. The resulting contradiction is simple. The most venerated are often the least free. There is also a calculus of value. An éclat might be sent as a diplomatic gift to secure alliances, or distributed among provincial elites to bind their loyalty to the Sapa Inca. Her fate is a ledger entry in an economy of power. When the empire seeks divine favor, it reaches beyond diplomacy into sacrifice. The Capacia is the most formalized example. Archaeology has corroborated what the chroniclers sketched. Children and adolescents placed on high peaks, decorated and entombed. Jon Reinhardt and others located some of these corpses in the late 20th century on summits above 6,000 m. The Lulo children and the maiden on Ampto are tangible proof. These finds show clothing woven with imperial techniques, ritual bundles and offerings arranged with deliberation. The cold preserved flesh, the braided hair, the textiles and the artifacts speak in forensic detail about a ceremony that combines sacrifice, state theater, and belief. The girls were not anonymous. They were selected, prepared, and honored according to a ritual script. But honor in this context is inseparable from annihilation. Scientific analyses have given us a chronology of preparation. Isotopic studies and hair chemistry revealed dietary changes, consumption of maize and llama meat, and in later phases, higher intake of cocoa and chicha, substances that sedated and steadied. The process of capaculture, as reconstructed by researchers such as Constanza Cerruti and others working on the Alu Leo, finds appears deliberate and technical rather than chaotic. The state invested resources to make its offerings persuasive to the gods. The ceremonial ascent, theory goods, the careful placement in ritual caverns or mountain shrines all confirm that this was a sacrificial system conducted by priests and officials working with logistical precision of the imperial state. The mechanics of a high-altitude burial are brutal in their efficiency. The child, dressed in finery and looped with ritual tokens, is carried in a procession accompanied by nobles and attendants. The road to a summit at 6:00 m is itself a test of endurance. The thin air forces the body, already fragile, into a struggle. At the peak, a chamber is prepared. The offerings are placed. The victim is seated or laid in position, sometimes supported on cushions, sometimes placed in a tightly constructed stone box. Chronicles assumed quick deaths, but forensic evidence shows slow endings. Hypothermia and asphyxia leave traces. The body cools, organs preserve, and the last hours can be reconstructed through the tools of modern pathology. It is not necessary to imagine nefarious violence beyond the ceiling. The ceiling is the violence. Alone inside a stone compartment at the summit, a human life winds down in a manner chosen by officials of the state. These rites are described in the language of piety by the people who instituted them. They are framed as gifts to end means to stabilize weather, fertility, and cosmic order. That piety is real, but the state enshed religious justification with political control. The selection of bodies for sacrifice served to display imperial reach. They traveled to distant provinces, selected girls with precise physical criteria, and carried them to the heights where the living could not easily retrieve them. The effect was demonstrative. The empire could place its own people into the heavens, and thus claim a cosmic sponsorship of rule. It was theology and public relations in one. The text of the Chronicle shows a double vision. Tizier de Leon records administrative procedures and lists of tribute. Garcilaso, writing later from a perspective sympathetic to Inca nobility, softens certain details but cannot erase the mechanics. Pedro Pizarro and others describe cohorts for the deceased Supper Inca, accounts of attendants and favorites in Tiembed with rulers. These accounts converge on the same fact. The state required human accompaniment for political theater, and faithful service could be final. When Hinapak died in 1527, virulent disease had already begun to ripple through the highlands. Smallpox introduced across the Estimas and spreading through trade networks decimated populations, and set the empire on a course of instability. The decimation intensified the uses of the Ales. The state, weakened by disease, and later by civil war, nevertheless maintained rituals that consumed bodies. The death of Hina Capac and the arrival of epidemics altered political alignments. The succession crisis between Huasca and Taualpur in the 1520s amplified the vulnerability of provincial orders and made the redistribution of women and titles a strategic tool. An eclair could be a bargaining chip, an ingredient in treaty, or a ward against rebellion. The Civil War diverted attention and resources, but the apparatus of ritual and tribute persisted, often with increased cruelty as factions sought legitimacy through displays of piety. The human cost did not abate because the empire was fracturing. If anything, it became more visible in the nightmarish choices made by local authorities. Into this turbulent landscape arrived the Spaniards, Francisco Pizarro and #39. Encounters with the Inca in 1532 and the capture of Atahualpa at Cajamarca are pivot points. The Spanish chroniclers record a scene of violence and confusion, but there is another effect rarely emphasized: the disruption of the ritual machinery. The long train system that moved girls from villages to a Tallahassee to summits depended on the continuity of imperial authority. Conquest did not immediately stop the practices, but it created openings and ruptures. In Cusco in 1532, many a careless found the locks unlatched, the mamacunas absent, and the eunuchs fleeing or dead. The city itself burned, and with it some of the ritual infrastructure that disciplined those inside the houses of the chosen. Chronically described moments of liberation appear in the sources. Pedro de Leon wrote that some of the chosen sought refuge with the Spaniards, that they fled the sacred prisons not into freedom as such, but into a different kind of servitude. For many, the choice was stark: remain within a system that guaranteed eventual annihilation in the name of the sun, or enter the uncertain brutality of colonial rule. The Spanish camp could at least offer a future where death by state ritual was not a scheduled certainty. The image of girls running to the conquerors complicates simple moral binaries. It shows that agency sometimes takes the form of choosing the lesser of two violences. Killer, a name that appears in scattered parish records as a converted indigenous woman in Lim, decades after conquest, is one of the survivors archetypal of many Ollies who endured. She was taken at 8, educated in the Akalahasi for 6 years, and released into a city reborn under new authority. The surviving records are sparse. Baptismal entries, intermittent mentions in encomenda accounts, a death recorded with causes consumption. But those cold notations map a life that escapes the tidy narrative of either sanitary piety or heroic resistance. Killer lived out her days in a colonial household serving an encomiend. She traded ceremonial garments for hard labor, but gained something crucial no imperial theology could give: time to age, to build a domestic routine to witness the slow lethal advance of Eurasian diseases that would take her at 29. The paradox of Killer's survival is emblematic. Her life illustrates how conquest reordered suffering. Under the Incaic system, she faced near certain death by ritual or by appointment with a noble &39's household. Under colonial order, she faced exploitation, conversion, and disease. Both regimes objectified her body, but one ended her life richly for a perceived higher order, and the other consumed her through labor and pandemic. The chronicles and parish registers reduced lives to entries, but when read alongside archaeological finds and forensic reports, they form a more complete account. Killer and #39's baptismal record anchors a human presence in the aftermath of the Empire and #39's collapse. Archaeologists like Johann Reinhard, Miguel Zaret, Constant Charity, and others found the dead, and then let the dead speak through material truth. The Lulau children found high on the Argentine-Chilean border wore garments with imperial motifs, carried offerings, and were arranged in ways that matched ritual descriptions in the chronicles. Radioarbon dates place some of these burials in the 15th and early 16th centuries, aligning them with an era when the capicotia was an established practice. The material evidence does not sanctify the acts, it documents them. The bodies preserved by cold give forensic scientists the ability to examine diet, disease, and last moments with a precision impossible for other ancient cultures. Hair chemistry indicates the intensification of maize, llama meat, cocoa, and chicha in the months before death. That intensification is a logistical signature. The empire prepared valuable offerings deliberately. The technical competence of the ritual is sobering. The offerings included miniature figurines, finely woven textiles, and the careful placement of food. None of this comforts the modern observer. It confirms that the state invested resources in sacrifice. The political calculus was stark. These offerings placed the Cosmol and displayed imperial power simultaneously. The ritualized killing of children at the sum. It was not the act of madmen, but of a government that chose to use its people as symbolic currency. That truth is an ethical challenge to historians. We must describe the rituals with clinical clarity and not allow reverence to obscure the violence. The burial of women with dead rulers is another practice that has left traces. Chronicles recorded mass interments and attendants killed at thierry rites of nobles and emperors. Spanish accounts of the late 15th and early 16th centuries report mass sacrifices associated with royal funerals. When Huáscar and Atahualpa fought for succession, the stakes included who could claim the most legitimate rights, the most convincingly sacred lineage. The female attendants who accompanied a deceased ruler into the tomb were not anonymous. Sometimes osteological evidence from tombs indicates positions inconsistent with a peaceful meditative death. Scratches and displaced bones suggest panic and struggle. These traces rewrite the rhetoric of willing sacrifice into a more complex reality, where some died resisting. The line between voluntary ritual and forced consumption is thin and ethically charged. Chroniclers like Bernab Cobo and Pedro Pizarro observed practice with horror and curiosity. Their descriptions were filtered by Christian categories that alternately demonized and sensationalized the acts. Archaeology resists those filters by turning to bodies and textiles, to strontium isotopes, and to the architecture of tombs. Evidence shows that some victims were groomed from childhood, others took part in ritual knowing its finality, and some appear to have been bound or positioned in ways that indicate duress. The state designed ceremonies to produce awe and compliance, but that design did not eliminate the possibility of coercion within the ritual. Consider the queue as bureaucratic evidence. Knotted cords recorded by Spanish observers tracked tribute obligations and personnel. The queue makes visible a system in which human lives could be quantified and transferred like maize sacks. To be selected for the Akalahasi could be written into an accounting that balanced provincial obligations against imperial need. That is the chilling administrative logic. The cleric and the priest share a ledger. The cura negotiates terms for his people while knowing that a single miscalculation will bring punitive response. The state is efficient in its selection and remorseless in its implementation. The politics of tribute included women as explicit entries. A man who hid a daughter to avoid sending her as tribute faced severe penalties, sometimes the death of his family. The historical records show cases where concealment led to reprisals. This logic turned parental love into leverage used by the state to enforce obedience. These are not metaphors. They are documented procedures. The Empire and #39's ability to centralize such practices across thousands of kilum made it unique in the pre-Columbian Americas and lethal to the vulnerable. Ritual pedagogy matters. Akalas were trained in a liturgy of sacrifice that made the acts seem natural and necessary. From their earliest days in the houses of the chosen, the girls learned songs and prayers that transformed their own mortality into an offering language. This pedagogy produced internalized consent in some cases. Women who embraced their role as sacred and who found dignity in the act of serving inai. But cultural acceptance does not erase coercion. The presence of indoctrination complicates moral judgments. It shows how a state can induce willing participation without removing structural violence from the act. Ethnographic parallels help us read past moral frameworks. Historical theologians and anthropologists have debated whether the Asela system was primarily spiritual or primarily political. The answer is that it was both. Inca cosmology bound social order to cosmic balance. The Sapa Inca claimed descent from the sun, and thus the capacity to mediate sacred obligations. By ritualizing tribute, the state fused political domination with spiritual authority. When we look at sacrificial victims, we must rate them in both registers. They are offerings to cosmic order and victims of a political system that treated certain bodies as expendable. The Spanish conquest practicalized different forms of violence, and common systems converted tribute into labor obligations under Spanish overlords, and indigenous women became household servants, domestic concubines, or were forced into European religious frameworks. The new colonial institutions had their own logics of domination. Baptism as control, in commander as an economic tool, and the colonial church as a partner in social reordering. For women, like Killer, this meant changing masters, but not necessarily experiencing kinder treatment. Life in a colonial household could be brutal, but it carried the unintended benefit of survival without ritualized death on a mountaintop or in airy chamber. The epidemiological shock the Old World carried allowed the Spanish to destabilize and do institutions rapidly. Smallpox and other diseases created demographic collapse, which the empire could not withstand. The political collapse removed the apparatus that scheduled deaths for ritual purposes, but it replaced those institutions with another form of extraction. Colonialism also rewired gendered power relations, embedding indigenous women more deeply into economic exploitation. The result was not liberation, but substitution. Ritual death was replaced with labor death, and spiritual sacrifice with economic disappearance. The historiography of the Atlas has been contested. For centuries, Spanish chroniclers shaped narratives that suited colonial aims. Later, nationalist historians sought to reclaim Inca institutions as evidence of civilizational complexity. In recent decades, archaeologists and historians have tried to balance these perspectives by foregrounding the experiences of the victims. Excavations, forensic pathology, and isotope chemistry return agency to the dead by telling us how they lived and died. This scholarship insists on a language precise enough to name coercion without erasing the cultural realities the dead inhabited. The scientific publications about the mummies are careful because the ethical stakes are high. Researchers publish radiocarbon dates, descriptions of textiles, and isotopic data that outline diet and mobility. They refrain from romanticized narratives of peaceable sacrificial girls content to die for cosmic harmony. Instead, they document preparation, patterns of selection, and physiological evidence of sedation in final weeks. These empirical findings are not emotive displays, but forensic statements. They allow historians to reconstruct both administrative intent and individual experience. The moral language we use matters. When museums display the Lula Laco children or Juanita from Otto, they present artifacts that draw crowds and dollars. Tourists gape at preserved hair and garments, unaware that they are looking at state homicide enshrined. Curators often balance respect with education, but public fascination runs the risk of aestheticizing suffering. Historians have an obligation to resist that glamour and to insist on the deliberate and police-driven character of these deaths. Beauty was systematically harvested by the state. The politics of display intersects with indigenous memory. Descendants of the regions where these girls were taken see the exhibits differently than international audiences. Some indigenous communities demand repatriation or respectful treatment, and scholars have to negotiate between scientific inquiry and cultural sensitivity. These conversations are part of the broader reckoning about how we handle human remains and the legacies of violence. They force institutions to confront the fact that applause for archaeological skill can mask the acknowledgement of past crimes. Consider the micro-history of a single textile. A cloak with topu indicates imperial ownership and high-status production. Its threads can be traced to specific regions. Its dyes analyzed for trade networks, and its pattern signifies authorized use by the elite. That cloak worn by an Acalia in Cappadocia is a material sign of the state and #39's investment in spectacle. It shows the convergence of economic surplus and ritual consumption. The empire grew rich enough to create art for death, and that art became the wrapping of young bodies. Textiles also tell of labor. Akolas who wove the finest cloth were skilled artisans. Their work contributed real economic value. The state used their skill to legitimize authority. That same skill produced the garments that would be used to bury them. There is a bitter symmetry. Their mastery as weavers became part of their erasure. The textile ties, craft, gendered labor, and sacrifice into a single continuum of state power. The role of regional elites is central. Caracas negotiated with imperial agents, sometimes deferring daughters to the center in exchange for peace or favor. Some Caracas gained prestige and material advantage by cooperating. Others suffered reprisals when they resisted. That tension between local survival strategies and the enforcement of central power explains much of the moral ambiguity in provincial decisions. A parent sending a daughter could be acting from calculation, from fear, or from a sense of duty shaped by centuries of custom and coercion. The archives keep the evidence of negotiations, quippers summarizing tributes, colonial accounts that list payments and depositions recorded by Spanish officials. These records show that the transfer of girls was integrated into a broader contract of rule. It was not arbitrary. It was systematic. By reading administrative records alongside archaeological evidence, we can see how the state turned intimate relationships into manageable resources. The gendered architecture of sacrifice should not be overlooked. Women were chosen for specific theological reasons, purity, youth, and perceived beauty, but also because gendered bodies were a medium for expressing authority. The Sapa Inca *39's relationship to the sun and to mythic ancestors required ritual acts that involved women *39's bodies as mediators. That theological claim had political consequences. If a woman was declared sacred to the sun, she became the property of the state and lost the protection of her natal family. Male attendants, eunuchs, and priests controlled the thresholds of this system. They policed purity rules and enforced seclusion. Their presence demonstrates that decisions about female bodies were concentrated in male hands. That asymmetry is not incidental. It is structural. It speaks to a political culture where the administration of sanctity rested on a gendered hierarchy that allowed some men to enforce ritual murder without accountability beyond the logic of cosmic order. The conquistadors documented many of these practices with a blend of fascination, pity, and opportunism. They used descriptions of human sacrifice to justify conquest, painting the Inca as barbarians to be supplanted by Christian rule. That rhetorical move served colonial policy, but modern historians must separate polemic from evidence. The violence the Spanish inflicted on indigenous populations was different in form, but sometimes parallel in logic, control, property, and the instrumentalization of bodies for political ends. When evaluating the record, we must account for bias. Spanish chroniclers had motives, religious, imperial, personal, that shaped their accounts. Indigenous witnesses, when recorded, were mediated by translation and by the priorities of colonial officials. Archaeology helps correct the narrative by providing hard data. Radioarbon dates, isotopic analyses, and contextual study of grave goods triangulate a reality that neither Spanish